Hey, everybody, and welcome to our lecture on conflict resolution and working outside of your comfort zone. Unfortunately, this is one of those lectures that is best done in person, where you can interact with people, where you can have mock conflicts and then resolve them and practice what we talk about. But since we're recording this, we can't really do that. But what I'm going to do is I am going to show you the activities that we would normally be doing if we were having this lecture in person. And then maybe you can, I don't know, create the activities with your friends or that you're living with, or family, or groups of people that you're around, that you're socially distanced with safely, and try to get some practice working with this stuff. You can also do this stuff remotely as well. You don't have to be in person to work through these conflicts. So I highly recommend that you try to make use of the things that we've talked about, maybe even participate in the activities, potentially with your project team, to get some practice working with conflict and trying to resolve it. The lecture itself is basically just in two main parts. The first part talks about what are the different components of conflict, and we'll introduce those, and then we'll talk about how to address those and how to use those to hopefully prevent conflict from occurring in the first place. And then we'll talk about the different ways that you can deal with conflict if it's actually occurring. All right, so let's jump right into the lecture with a discussion of the optional kickoff activity. You don't have to do this if you don't want to. It's called Anything Goes. And the way that you do this is you pick up a person to work with, so you have a pair, and you face each other, and you start off by saying some trivial phrase like nothing, something, anything. And then once you get to that word anything, you just state the name of some sort of an item. So it can be anything: dog, tables, coffee, pizza, football, whatever. Both of you just say something, all right? Anything, something, whatever. Then you have to debate with the other person as to why you think that your item would beat the other person's item. All right. The goal here is that you want to win this argument. You want to be able to say, why are dogs better than pizza? All right. It seems a little bit trivial, but that's the point of the activity here, is that you're trying to have some sort of a conflict with somebody, even though it's artificial, and then you're trying to win. All right. So after you're doing this for 2 to 3 minutes, you want to take some time to discuss the difference that you had between debate and dialogue. Debate is where you're sort of arguing with somebody about something you're trying to win, and the other one is where you're dialoguing. You're just trying to talk to the person, not in a conflicting way, but in more of like a conversational way. Okay. And then continue your conversation after you're done with that, except now you have to dialogue. Okay. So you start off by debating, then you have a brief discussion about the difference between debate and dialogue, and then you finally dialogue. Okay. In this situation, you want to ask questions, you want to listen to the answers to those questions, and then you want to try to come to an agreement as to which of the two items that you picked is better, all right, which would win, so to speak. I personally think that dogs would beat pizza, but I'm not really sure, right? You might agree that, pizza beats dogs because cats beat dogs and cats beat pizza. I don't know. All right, so it's a fairly trivial thing, okay? But it does get you into the mood of having sort of a conflict or a debate with someone, and then contrasting that with what it feels like to have a dialogue. Okay, and then when you're done with that, just do a little bit of a debrief of the overall thing, to try to figure out, like, how did you react when you were in this mini conflict? Was it the same way that you interact in normal conflict situations, where you're having a fight with a friend, or somebody at work, or a fellow student, or whatever? Then try to figure out, were you able to come to a consensus, and if so, how did you do it? Right. And then also try to think about other situations where you've been in and where you disagree with someone. When you're disagreeing with them, do you always stop and ask questions, or do you find it hard to listen to them? And why is that the case? Right? Do you just sort of shut down and just try to charge your way through, or do you take a step back and try to do some active listening and come to a consensus and collaborate with the person? All right. Yeah, and then once you're done with that, think about the future, right? Like, is it better to have a debate, or is it better to have a dialogue? Depends, I guess, right? But typically, if you're trying to resolve a conflict in a meaningful way, uh, dialogue is the better approach because it leads to less conflict, right? You're listening and you're asking questions and you're treating the other person with respect as opposed to just trying to win, right? Okay, so before we get into the actual 7 components of conflict, I have a few initial thoughts here about conflict and then some quotes that are associated with them. The first is that conflict is not a bad thing. All right, conflict happens all the time. It's a natural part of human interaction, and it's necessary, all right, to help work through problems and to help to come up with new solutions to problems, all right. So a couple of quotes here, one of them from Gandhi of all people. Honest disagreement is often a good sign of progress, right? So if you have people that are conflicting about various things, if they have disagreements, and if they're honest disagreements, that they're not just like petty things about, oh, I don't like you because you don't like Cheerios. I like Rice Krispies. Or like, as long as it's an honest disagreement, you're probably making some progress, right? There's people are taking a stake in the decisions that are being made, and disagreements are just naturally going to come from that. Another one: good stories are driven by conflict, tension, and high stakes. Right? If you think about any movies that have come out recently and or within your entire life, there's always a conflict that's involved in a movie. It's one of the driving elements of every story that you see on the big screen, and so it's sort of necessary for life to have this conflict because the conflict resolution is usually the part of the movie that makes you feel good, right? All right, the next one: managing conflict is hard and it takes time. Thomas Paine says the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph, right? So if you have a really hard conflict that you're working through and it just takes days and days and weeks, maybe even months and months to figure out how it's going to be resolved, the more glorious the triumph it will be, right? Because you put in so much effort. I don't know if I completely agree with that, right? It's like you don't want to be arguing for years and years and years, and when you finally come to a resolution, you're like, wow, that was awesome. But if you think about it though, like, if you really have to struggle hard to come up with a solution to something, it probably means that you're putting in a lot of effort to the final resolution, and that it's going to be a good, well thought out resolution. Another one: a wise ruler, when he makes his laws, is bound to find himself in conflict with the world. Yep, it's just wherever you go, whatever happens, you're going to have conflict somewhere. You're not going to have everybody in agreement with you on everything. Okay, so it's going to take time. It's going to be hard to deal with those people that disagree with you. It's going to be hard to try to convince them to agree with you or to dialogue with them. It's not easy, right? So conflict isn't bad, but it's also not easy, and it takes time to deal with. And then last one: it will necessarily happen. Conflict will necessarily happen no matter how hard you try. And in the words of Brad Pitt, happiness is overrated. There has to be conflict in life. All right. Yeah, I've sort of already said it before. Movies, they got a conflict because you want to get to the resolution. Life is sort of the same sort of a thing. There's going to be conflicts in life, and resolving them is going to bring you joy for the most part. Okay, so what are the 7 components of conflict? The first one, probably the biggest one, is communication, right? Good communication can prevent conflict. Bad communication can cause it. All right. If you have effective communication, you're going to have open dialogue and you're going to have active listening. Open dialogue means that everyone is free to speak what they feel, free to speak what they mean without any judgment. And active listening is basically the act of sitting back and really listening to what someone is saying, not just letting the words go in one ear and then come out the other side. They're actually sitting back and thinking about what they're saying and taking an active role in trying to understand what they're saying and try to think about things from their perspective. All right, so open dialogue and active listening are 2 examples of good communication that will help to prevent conflict. The second component is competition. All right. And this can come in a variety of different forms. It can be over money, it can be over time, it can be over people. All right. Anytime you have a lack of those resources, you're going to have conflict, and also an abundance of the same may prevent it. All right. So if you have a lot of money, if you have a lot of time, if you have a lot of people, you may be able to prevent conflict. Okay, but not in the absence of good communication. Right. So try to make sure that you are as well funded as you possibly can, that you give enough time to a project that you're trying to work on, and that you have the right people on the project. Right. If you have the wrong people, if you have conflicting personality types, that's going to be a problem. If you have hardly any money, if you have enough money to fund 2 people and you try to get people on a 5-person team, not going to happen because people are not going to get paid. Same thing goes with time. If you have 3 weeks to finish a project that realistically could only be done in 3 months, that's going to cause a lot of conflict. Okay. Next, inconsistency. This is something that frequently comes up between the users or the stakeholders, your boss, and what you are trying to do. Okay, so your users come up with a set of unclear, unstable, non-consistent rules or expectations about what your product should be, and you have to try to come up with a solution for that. Or your boss tells you something that is in direct conflict to what you think the user wants. Okay, your boss says that you need to do one thing on the project, and your users say that they want something completely different. That's going to, by just the very nature of those things being different, going to cause conflict. Okay, so to help combat that, to help deal with that conflict and prevent it from occurring at all, you need to be as consistent as you possibly can in the gathering of user requirements, the creation of rules that are going to dictate, when you're working on the project, when you're not working on the project, how the team's going to communicate, and that if there's anything that's unclear, you clear it up as quickly as you possibly can. All right. If you don't understand what the user wants, figure out what they want. Don't just sit down and try to develop a solution for a week or 2 or a month, and then come back to the user and say, well, here's the solution that I came up with, and I did it all based on my assumption that this is what you wanted me to do. All right. You don't want to make assumptions. You want everything to be crystal clear and signed off on by your user that this is exactly what you should be doing. All right. The next component of conflict is diversity. Now, this isn't intended to be a negative thing here. It's just intended to be a point to be made of something that can cause conflict and something that you should address. And there's actually an activity that we're going to do, or I'm going to talk about at the very end of the lecture here. When you have a sort of a modern team in most modern companies, there's going to be a large diversity of cultures, experiences, races, religions, disabilities, genders, and ages. All right. You're not going to find much diversity in age, unfortunately or fortunately, depending upon how you view it, in age. In the tech world tends to be fairly young, people in their 20s. A lot of reasons why that's the case. A lot of younger people in their 20s don't yet have like significant family commitments, so they can put in the hours that a lot of these companies require, 60 hours a week or whatever to work. And then as people get older, they start families, they get wiser, and they don't want to work for 60 hours a week, and so they tend to move, to higher levels of management or whatever. I don't know, just pick your analogy here. Like it is sort of what it is. Just the workforce in the tech industry tends to just be younger. And unfortunately, it tends to be more male dominated from a gender perspective. But all of those things are necessary if you want to have a good final product. We talked about it a long time ago in the toxic technology lecture, right? Diversity is important to creating effective solutions to pretty much everything, right? And when you instead of allowing that diversity to cause conflict, right? Like the old fidgety or old crotchety grandpa, always conflicting with those little youngsters. Instead of that being a source of conflict, let that be something that you embrace, all right? Embrace the differences. Understand that all those different originally conflicting potentially conflicting views that would come from different cultures or races or religions or whatever can actually generate new ideas. And those new ideas are valuable in a lot of ways, in particular in the pursuit of creative solutions to problems. Okay. So when you are presented with a huge diversity of those different areas that we just talked about, use that as a source of good. All right. Use that as a benefit as opposed to the opposite. Right. You don't want it to cause conflicts. You want to value the different views and the different ideas that all of those people have from all of those different groups so that you can come up with a more effective solution to a problem. Okay. So diversity is good, but it can lead to conflict if you don't value it as such. All right. The next component of conflict is perspective. And you could maybe lump this in with the diversity thing if you just said some people have conflicting perceptions of issues. All right. But, you can have two people that are identical from a diversity perspective, and they can have completely conflicting perceptions of various issues. Political views, for example, are one of those things. Like you don't really know what someone's views are on a topic politically unless you ask them. Okay, you can make assumptions, but those assumptions are usually based on implicit biases, and as we all know, implicit biases are a horrible thing to make use of when you're trying to evaluate, an aspect of a certain person, right? So conflicting perceptions of various issues, those are almost always going to lead to conflict, but you should approach this in the same way as we would want to do with diversity, right? Understand that conflicting perceptions for issues are an important part of creating stronger designs and more effective solutions to problems. If you can look at all the different perceptions of various issues, okay? It's good to understand both sides of the story. Like I do that with my kids all the time. When they have a fight, assuming it's just like, Elliot versus Owen, they're having a fight, they're having a conflict because they have different perceptions of the issue. I always try to sit down with each of them individually and ask them what is their perception of the problem as opposed to the others. And then I bring them together and say, this is how Elliot viewed the situation. This is how Owen viewed the situation. What's the consensus of the two here so that we can try to resolve this conflict without, having this huge diversity of perceptions. And it usually results in fairly effective conflict resolution. Every once in a while it doesn't get anywhere, but that's sort of the best way to do it, is to give each person in the conflict the respect to have their own perception, and then allow them to voice their concerns and their views, and then sort of bring it all back together and try to summarize the conflict with both parties and hopefully arrive at a collaborative solution. All right, the sixth component of conflict is interdependency. All right, this is definitely something that can come up with software development because a lot of modern software can consist of highly interdependent, not only groups, but also components, right? Just the software itself is highly dependent. Or highly interdependent. Yeah. So, when you're working with people, right? If you have a large group of people and there's either that or there's a lot of interactivity or both, there's a huge potential for there to be conflict, right? The more interdependent, the larger the group and the more interactive the group is, the more opportunity you have for other elements or components of conflict to come into play. So differing perspectives, diversity, lack of communication, what else? Competition, inconsistency, right? If you just have a larger group, it's naturally going to have more of those things popping up. All right, so there's a lot more potential there. Yeah, that's pretty much it. From a software perspective, though, like if you have multiple different components and multiple different external APIs, any number of issues can come up with any number of those little pieces. Or if like one API is modified and it no longer accepts inputs the way that you're sending them, your whole system can break, right? It'll go into conflict from a technical perspective. All right, so it's very important that you understand that this interdependency can cause a problem. And from the people side of things, right, when you're working with large groups of people, Make sure that you understand other people's points of view, needs, priorities, diversities, perceptions, etc. All right, the final the final component of conflict is what's called emotional intelligence. Okay, and emotional intelligence, if you have a lot of it, actually prevents conflict. All right, the problem is not having enough emotional intelligence, which is referred to as EQ. Okay, as opposed to IQ, it's EQ. People that have high EQ tend to be empathetic and sensitive, and those that don't are the opposite. Right, they're totally unempathetic and they're totally insensitive. I don't even know if unempathetic is a word, but I said it. Unempathetic. Hey, look at my little text capturing service. I guess it's a word. I don't know. All right. So, anyways, empathy and sensitivity. Those are the traits that where you can you think about others, you think about their views, you try to understand why they feel the way that they do, why they have the views that they do. And empathy is, having respect, feeling, trying to feel the way that they feel without thinking only about yourself, right? Empathy is lacking in a lot of places in the world. Some people argue that our sort of retraction inward with our devices and always staring at screens and interacting with people through chats and memes and things like that is leading to a significant lack of empathy. And, I don't see it yet with my kids because they're still pretty young, but that's sort of the place where it starts to take hold is when you have kids that spend all their time in front of a screen, their ability to be empathetic is greatly reduced. Okay. And so if you want to have high IQ, you need to be empathetic and you need to be sensitive. All right. So this also means that you have to maintain appropriate boundaries. Okay. If you haven't had a lot of experience working with others and dealing with conflict and practicing conflict in the context of a classroom, for example, it's going to be hard for you to do that when you're out in the world, when you have a job and you're on a team. If you haven't had a chance to practice conflict resolution and develop empathy and sensitivity, it's going to be hard for you to maintain appropriate boundaries. All right. So thankfully, EQ is one of those things that you can actually improve. There's a whole bunch of different books that are written about EQ. I think there's one that I have, but I've yet to read. It's called like EQ Explained or something like that. And you essentially need to figure out how to bring together your professional conduct and also your emotions in a way that it helps to prevent conflict and it helps you to interact with others in a way that is going to make them feel comfortable, to trust you, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so EQ is very important. I probably haven't done it enough justice in this description here, but needless to say, the main components of it are empathy and sensitivity to others. And this component of conflict is naturally sort of combines with the ones from the previous slide here about just being considerate of others, right? And that's going to just help to prevent conflict from the start. And then when conflict does start, still be considerate of others and try to view things from their viewpoint, because it's going to do a lot in the interest of helping you understand what everything is happening and what's going on. Okay, so this next slide here, we're almost to the end, believe it or not, are the 5 basic ways to resolve a conflict. The first way is the worst way, and that's to ignore it. Okay, you basically just put it off and don't do anything. All that's doing is just ignoring something that's going to get worse over time. All right, if there's miscommunication or a lack of clarity in your project, and if you ignore that, all right, so if your project sponsor, for example, is not communicating with you properly or not addressing the requirements of the project, and they basically never communicate with you, they don't show up at meetings, and you don't address that by ignoring it, it's just going to get worse. Okay, you have to nip that in the bud at the very beginning and get that out of the way. The second way to resolve a conflict is win-lose. So you basically just exert as much control as you possibly can over your adversary and you win. All right? This is also not a good way to win a conflict, right? You don't want to have to force your opinions on somebody else until you win, right? That's sort of the debating way of working with conflict. And like I said, debates, they do have their purpose, all right? Or else we wouldn't have things like presidential debates, although you could argue that current presidential debates have been not effective at all. But in general, like debates, they've been around for centuries, right? Like it's a good way for two different parties that are at conflicting ends to have a conversation. And as long as the debate is more on the side of dialogue, from like as long as you have a good moderator that's there to help maintain decorum and all that kind of stuff, debates can be very effective at working through problems. But if you don't have that moderator, if it's just two people sitting in a room having an argument, dialogue is a lot more effective than debate. All right, the third one, lose, win. So this situation is where you basically just quit, you just give up, say, I give in, you win. If you don't care too much about the conflict, this is okay, I guess, right? But it's not necessarily the best approach either, because the person that wins, okay, that you give into, your opponent, they don't necessarily learn anything here. They don't think about your perspective. They don't have to consider the nuances of the situation. They don't have to use their emotional intelligence. They just have to sit back and let you give up. All right. The next one is lose-lose. So you agree on a compromise, but both parties have to give something up. Now, you could sort of contrast this with number 5, which is win-win, right? You could argue that if you compromise on something or you come up with a collaborative solution, it's not going to be the exact solution that you wanted to have to begin with. So you technically did give something up. All right. But there is a slight difference here. In lose-lose, you agree on a compromise, but you do it by just saying, okay, fine, I give that up. And then you just sort of walk away and you're sort of angry that you had to give that piece up. All right. And so contrast that with win-win, where you're still compromising, right? But in this situation, you spend a lot of time coming up with a collaborative solution where everybody gets their needs met, right? You're not giving something up just to come to a compromise. You're setting it up so that everybody can have their needs met, or if they had to change some of their needs, they agree with those changes and they don't view it as if they had to give something up. Okay. And unfortunately, even though this is the best way to resolve a conflict, it's also one of the hardest ways to solve a conflict. Okay. Because it requires a lot of dialogue, a lot of collaboration, a lot of sitting in a space that you are likely not comfortable with. All right. And so, that sort of briefly touches on the other part of this lecture is working outside of your comfort zone. Working outside of your comfort zone is basically just having a conflict, right? If you're having a conflict, unless you like conflict, you're generally going to be working outside of your comfort zone, right? Most people don't like being in conflict or being adversarial because it generates all sorts of negative emotions, okay? So, yeah, those are the 5 basic ways to resolve a conflict. Yeah. All right, so the last thing I have here is an optional activity that you can participate in, and this is an activity to sort of help you figure out how diverse everyone is in and around you. Okay, so first thing you want to do is this requires a fair amount of people, so try to split up into teams of anywhere from 6 to 10 people. All right, and then you have to come up with 3 different ways to classify yourselves into subgroups. Okay. So there are some rules here that are associated with this. First, there's no limit on the number of subgroups, okay? Except that each subgroup has to have at least 2 team members. So if you have, a group of 6, you have to make sure that each of those subgroups has at least 2 people. So if it was at least or at most 2 people, you'd have 3 groups of groups of 2, right? So that's 6 total people. If you had 10 people and you had 2 people in each group, that would be 5 subgroups, okay? Each of the subgroups has to contain approximately the same number of people, so it has to be fairly balanced. Okay, you can't have in a group of 10 people a subgroup of 2 and then a subgroup of 8. All right, they need to be more balanced. And then finally, the criteria that you use to classify the people into the subgroups can't have any negative characteristics. All right. So some examples: the types of food that you like. What are your hobbies? How often do you exercise? What are your favorite ways to exercise? Where have you traveled to? All right. So those are the examples on the slide over there. And so the goal here is to, if you have a group of 6, if you picked types of food that you like, hopefully that's a way to subdivide to where you have like 2 people that like Italian food, 2 people that like Mexican food, and 2 people that like good old American hamburger food or something like that. I don't know. So yeah, do that. And then when you're done doing that, ask yourself some questions. First, what did it take to find out and think about each other in different ways? Okay, what did you have to do? What types of questions did you have to ask each other to try to come up with these classifications that would cause you to break up into subgroups of equal size, all right, where you have at least 2 people in each subgroup. And then next, how might this affect your team members' interactions, contributions, and ability to collaborate? Okay. This is basically an exercise in the so-called we are all alike, we are all different, right? Like we can always find something that we're all alike on, and we can usually always find something that we're all different on. And to like in this example right here, you had to come up with 3 different ways to classify yourselves into subgroups. It's highly unlikely that the 3 different ways are going to result in the exact same 3 subgroups. Okay, person A and B might be together in the first set of subgroups, and then person A and D might be together in the second set of subgroups, and then person A and L might be together in, well, actually L I think is past 10 people. So let's say A and B. No, we are already together. A and B are already together. So A and F, all right, we're together in the third set of subgroups. So the point here is that, person A is alike persons B, and I can't remember what they were, D and F, but is also different than them in other areas. Okay, so this activity is intended to basically bring up examples of the different types of diversity that exist in your group of people, and also the different types of similarities, and help you understand that, even though you might all seem completely different from each other, you're actually also kind of alike, right? Because you're all human, right? So yeah, that's the basic point of this activity. And if you get a chance, I recommend trying to do it if you got a group of 6 to 10. All right, so that's pretty much it. We talked about the 7 main components of conflict and the 5 basic ways of resolving a conflict. We talked about, the basic ways to deal with conflict in an effective way, so dialoguing and active listening. And there isn't much else that we can do to talk about it other than to just throw you into a conflict and let you work through it. It's kind of like programming, in my opinion, right? Like I can tell you everything that you need to know about classes and iteration and selection and functions and all that kind of stuff. But in order for you to really experience and understand how programming works, you have to go out and do it. And with conflict, unfortunately, or fortunately actually, you have to go out and get in conflict. All right, as we saw in the very first few slides, it's inevitable, it's necessary, it's important, it's part of everyday human interactions, and being able to understand when you're in conflict and to have the fairly basic tools to resolve it is incredibly important. Okay, so that's all I got for this topic today, and I'll see y'all later. Bye-bye.